Hello and welcome to another episode where we seek to complete our bike hiring manager full stack application. And we've already scaffolded our front end or our template. We are able to add the variables, full name, identity, gender, customer type, create an active trip, begin a counter, end a trip, establish the total duration and the cost. But we are storing our data in memory, which is volatile. We need now to create a mechanism to enable us persist our data in a more persistent memory, so to speak, and that would be local storage, which is a client-side facility. When I say client-side, I mean in the browser. So just to demonstrate what we will be building, let me just go to the hood of the browser, under the hood, and under the applications tab, that's where we find the various elements that would augment a client-side application. So from applications, over the top where you have your service workers that would ideally keep track of the state of your application, whether there's internet connectivity or there's no connectivity, and how the application behaves, how to make the application installable, yet it's still a web application. That is the service worker end. On the storage is where we are most interested in regards to our cause of adding some persistence in our application. So we have local storage, we have session storage, we have indexed DB, we have cookies. Most of the times when you see websites asking you to agree to cookie storage, the cookies will be under this particular menu, the cookies menu. So we have cache storage, we have storage buckets, and finally we have background services. If we are doing push messaging, speculative loads, notifications, you have bounce tracking, you have back and forward cache, background syncing. That is where it would be. But for us, we will be looking at storage and specifically local storage. So let me just click on what we have over here. So on the right hand side, that shows us the structure of local storage. So you'll have a key. You can visualize, you can think of a key like a table pointer. Then the value is the data. Ideally, these will be an array of objects. So as you can see, we have the top level is an array. Then for each element of that array is objects of the data that is held as a record. Normally, this data is stored as a string. So it's a JSON array. It's a JSON object that is stringified, and it will only be placed on under the key that you have specified in your application. In this particular case here, you have a bike hiring data, and that key has values, and the values are the records that come from your application. So that is what we'll be trying to simulate. I will delete that so that we can create a new local storage key and values that persist even after a page reload. So without further ado, let me just close this. We'll just bring it up again. I'll go to our VS Code and we will try now to think of what we can now go ahead and design our thought process on how we're gonna incorporate local storage persistence in our application. You can see I've decided to do, from the console, I've decided to do a new branch for local storage. So this will denote all the changes that we will have incorporated in our code in regards to persistence. I'll close the console and I'll proceed to the bottom of our main.js file, and let's just begin by thinking how it will affect our code. Remember, everything now is in memory. That is the RAM. That is where we are storing our data. But we are saying upon creating an active trip, of course we are saving it. So the number one thing we will do is to save trip to local storage. After that, what we are doing, we are updating. Once we close a trip, we are updating that particular trip by adding new attributes. We are creating a duration. Let's just have a look at what is happening so that you can appreciate how we are going to incorporate local storage. So we want to see where we are ending our trip. Let me just search end trip. Yeah, here it is. So as you can see, we are having a new attribute called end time. We are also adding a duration, which is also an attribute that's changing for the trip entity. We are also having an attribute called cost, and the status changes. So after adding our trip, the next thing that we will do is definitely updating what will be in the localhost. So let me just go down and just add another space and another one, just 3 spaces, and say update trip on completion. So the trip will have a few entities that are populated. So therefore it means our local storage, which acts as our database in the client, will have to change. And then after that, we will, in all scenarios, 1, 2, 3, in all scenarios, we will have to pull out that data. It's like performing a select in MySQL. We are going to pull all that data from local storage, especially when the app is initializing. So what we will do is to load all entries from local storage. So that is what will happen. So we will save. We'll have a function that assists us to save in our local storage. We'll have another action that helps us to update a trip which is completed, and then we will be loading everything from the local storage. So I feel we should begin with to save. You see how we save that data, or do we begin with no, let's just begin with saving that data. Now when I was doing the demonstration on local storage, I showed how it sits on the client. You have a key and a value. It's a key value set. The key is a pointer to where the data is seated. Ideally, the data is a string, which is basically a stringified JSON object. So it's an array of objects that is denoted by a key. So at the very top, let's just begin with defining our storage key. So right above the prices, so I want to define a constant. I'll call it storage key. So this, you can name it any way you want. So just call it bike hire. I'll just call it that, bike hire. Let me just use the snake case, but it's a constant. Let me just call it bike hire. No problem. Bike underscore hire. So this is the key that we will use to reference our so-called local storage database. It will point to where we have our values, and in our values we will basically package our data, our trip data, is an array of objects. And it will be an array of objects because you see, when we are talking of active trips, it's an array. When we are talking of completed trips, it's an array. And that array will store an object called a trip. The only thing that distinguishes a completed trip and an active trip, the main thing is usually the trip status. And now you can also look at the other attributes that are coming on board, like the duration, the cost. But the key thing, how you distinguish between an active and a completed trip, is the status. So having defined our key, then we will now begin thinking of how do we save that data in our local storage. So remember, what we are storing is a couple of objects, trip objects, and that is what I'm going to show you how to do. So let's just scroll down. We go to where we have save trip, and we will define. In fact, I'm getting an idea as I'm doing these. After doing this local storage, because it has its own disadvantages, and normally, as much as data is persisted on your database, and as much as you're saying we are going to sync it to a local, a remote database, then you have to know that if the data in your system, in your computer system or phone, for that matter, is becoming less and less available, then the operating system will start automatically looking for areas it can begin to uh, prune memory. And the first place is local storage and data that is not really pertinent into the system. So local storage could be automatically removed by the operating system. That's why now we'll come up with another solution of syncing our data to a remote service. But we can also do another persistent mechanism that looks more or less like SQL, that's called indexed DB. So that gives us some flexibility, some atomicity. It gives us the attributes, it almost simulates the attributes of a relational database, an SQL database. So what I'll do, well, let me not digress a lot. Let us continue with our function here. For now, we are dealing with local storage. So let's do a function that saves our records into local storage. So we'll say save to local storage. I hope by now you are familiar with the snake case that I'm using. So when I say snake case, is the first letter is in lowercase and any subsequent letter to a new word is in uppercase. The two, the L in local and the S in storage, all of them are in uppercase. And that is how I'll define even our variables. So local storage is an API that is provided for in our browsers. So it's present and JavaScript natively supports it. So it is relatively simple to add items. We just call the local storage object and set an item. So how we're gonna do it is like this. So we say local storage. So you can see even the browser, for some reason, has that in the IntelliSense. So let's say local storage dot, it's an object. So you can see all these methods here. So clear, it's you just basically deleting everything. Get item, you are getting an item by the key. You can see the argument is storage.get item and then the key. So let me just, so here what we want to do, we want to set an item. You can see storage.set item takes a key. So set item. So remember at the very top we had defined our key using a constant. So we have a storage key there. And then, as I said, we are storing an array of objects. But local storage does not take it as, it cannot take that kind of a data structure. So we'll have to convert that into into a string. So I'll say so remember we have trips. So what I'll say JSON dot stringify So remember we have two arrays here. So our data looks like we have active trips, and we have completed trips. We have completed trips. On second thought, I feel like we need to refactor our code, and what we are going to do is we're just going to have trips. We're just going to have an array of trips. So for us to save trips, the trips array will have both completed and active trips because we already have attributes for each kind of trip. So what we will do, we will just remove the active and completed trips, and we'll just have trips just to make it a bit efficient. So remember our our object has attributes that distinguish an active from a complete trip. So let us just refactor our code so that we use one array. So when we start our trip, we were using active trips.push. So here we are going to use trips.push. So remember everything now, just to ease complexity, we will be using one array, that is trips. So when we start a trip and when we clear our trip, so even when we read update active trip table, so we'll be reading it from trips. Then when we go to end trip, we are going to be pushing to trips. So that will bring another element of filtering, and we will see it as we proceed. But let's work on this first. So update trip, also this should be reading from somewhere. Let's see. It's reading from completed trips, so it will be trips. Then let's see, update completed trips, end trip. We have pushed trips. So we have another update method. Where does it do? How are we updating active trips table? So this should be trips. So I think we are done with that, such that now we have one array to ease complexity. So so we are calling local storage object, then we are saying set item, the storage key, we are providing that. Then as you can see, the storage key is bike hire, and then we are stringifying that particular array of objects. Then how do we update a trip on the local storage? So this one will be interesting. So this one will say function update. So this is we are updating function. So to update our trips, it's actually one trip that we'll be updating. So we'll have function update trip in local storage. So remember, so when we are updating, we are passing a trip here at the very top, the updated trip. Just call it updated trip. So we need to extract all the data and pass it, bring it back to JavaScript data structure, that is an array of objects. Then try to get that item, update it, and return that object into that data structure, and stringify that data structure and push it back to local storage. So I know that's a mouthful. So what we do, we say store data, the data in local storage equals local storage dot get item. So we are getting data from using our key. So it's storage key, local storage dot get. Yeah. So we have fetched all our data. So we want to check whether it's null or we've gotten our data. So to do that, so we say if stored data, if it's truthy, then let trips equals, now we want now to, you remember we stored an object, we stored a string over here. So we want to revert it back to a data structure that JavaScript can understand. And to do that, what we say, we say json.pass. Let me see whether they'll give us the documentation. So they say converts a JavaScript object notation into an object, converts a JavaScript object notation string into an object, and an object is easily understandable by JavaScript. So what we do, we pass the stored data, which is a string, the stored data. So we'll say update active trips table. So we'll call it here. I hope I've just typed it well. Let me see, update active trips. Yeah, that's it. And then update completed trips table. So that is what happens. Now we need to bring the context of local storage to these methods, and we will start with update active trips. I have a feeling that is where we begin, because once you click see the method here. Once you click start trip, that is where now we will begin now talking of updating these active trips table. So we begin there. Again, once you click the start trip button, what you do, you are starting a trip. And that is why your first interaction, even before you update the table, that is where your first interaction with the local storage begins. So we begin at start trip method. So where is it? Start trip. So you can even see the first instance here. So we are saying once you document.get element by ID, the start trip, add event listener click, then you call the event handler start trip. So this is where we begin, and we begin building our context from this method, and we'll be saying that yes, you have created a trip and you have pushed it to an array, the trips array. And let me just remove this console.logs because we already know we are we are getting that data. So you update active trips table. Yeah, you can see now where you are updating this trips table with the data that you inputted from here. So once you click on this button, it pushes that trip to the trips array, and it also now clears the customer forms table. So we need to say that we have something else that's called local storage. We will do save to local storage, so that we are able now to persist our data inside local storage. Just remove those semicolons for uniformity. So let us have a look again at what is happening here when we say save to local storage. Let me click and go to that. So you can see local storage dot set item, the storage key, and the data that we are passing here is a string. You can see an intrinsic object that provides functions to convert JavaScript values to and from JavaScript object notation format. So this is this is the definition for JSON, the JSON object. So here we are converting the trips. You see the trips where we have just pushed the new trip. We are converting that from an object to a string, and we are adding it to this to the local storage, yeah, under the key bike hire. So remember now trips will be an array of objects, and we are converting it. As you can see, trips is an array of type any, and we know it will carry trips which are objects. So it's an array of objects. So that is why we are calling that save to local storage. But again, I want to assume that what happens when we have our trips data, we have added that and to the local storage. What happens after that? Because now our state will be, if we refresh the page, we do not want to see our data getting lost. So what we will do, I would want us to test first and see what is happening. So we have just dealt with, let me go to start trip again, start trip. So we have just said that once you start the trip, then save to local storage. Let's see what happens. So I need to inspect this so that we can see whether we are successfully adding anything. So under application, what we will be looking for under local storage, remember we have nothing under local storage. What we'll be looking out for is a key with the value of this object now as a string. So we'll be looking for something with an entry of bike hire if we have no any errors. So let's test this. So we are going to application and local storage. So we're saying identity, we provide an identity. So the gender is female, type is a dot, and we start. So immediately you see we have a bike hierarchy and values. So we have achieved our goal of persisting data in our client. But now, let me just show you something. As much as this data is running, we have not, have we said how we are, how the application behaves when we reload? Let's just reload. So I've reloaded, and despite the data being there, you can see we have nothing. Yeah. So the data is still there, but we have nothing. So what we do, we have to ask ourselves, where are we getting this data on second reload? So we'll go back to our code. So on reload, we need that data. And what I'll do, just below where we add our event listener, I will call the function load from, no, not there, here, load from local storage. So once I call that, let me just go to it. So you can see what it does. It will update active trips table and update completed trips table. But now, what is happening on update active trips? Because that is what we have added a trip and we want to see it. So we are saying we will have our trips here. So we need these two methods to pick the trips. So let's just reload and see whether that is happening or not. It's not happening. So let's see what could be wrong. Do we have any errors? Stored data is not defined. At here. So it means we have, it's a typo again. It's a typo. So 159. It's very good to look at the console. So you see here we are referencing stored data all through up to this point until here where we feel we need to say storage, but it's stored data. So the error has disappeared, and you can see now that we have our trip. So let me add something else here and say the identity will give 1, then we say he's a male, then say the child will add. So the first functionality of starting trips is working perfectly. But let's just confirm for the sake of it and see whether our local storage has anything. So we go to application, then local storage, and as you can see, we have two items. So we have our bike hire pointer to the value. It's a key value. It points to these values here. And below here, you can see all the values, what each value stands for. Now, we need to think of what happens when we click the end trip button. Once we click this button here, we have an event listener. And let me just walk you through it. So under our HTML, let's see, where is it? No. So this is the active trips, and we are dynamically loading this action here. So let's see, update active trips. Update here. So it should be here. So you can see under update active trips, once we add each trip, we introduce a counter, and we have an event handler for on click, the end trip method. So let's look at end trip. What happens when you are in end trip? End trip. So here we are. So we are passing the ID of the trip, and we go to active trips. Remember, now we said we are not dealing with active trips. So we said we are dealing with trips. You have a single array now. You're dealing with trips. If you find that index, then if you don't find it, let's say if trip equals -1, then you return. So if you don't find it, you cancel the execution, exit. Then if you find it, then you say the trip equals to, this should be trips. It's good that we are going through this. Remember, we refactored and removed the two arrays. We had an array for active trips and completed trips, and we said since our entity has attributes to distinguish whether a trip is active or inactive, then we maintain one array for simplicity, and we will introduce filtering, right? So we found that trip. So for the trip, we introduce an end time, a duration, we calculate a cost, and the trip status. So that happens. So what do we do now? So we push the trip into the trips array. Actually, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think this is necessary because already we have found the trip over here, and we are working. There's no need for us pushing it again. So that's the advantage of working with one giant array with elements that are distinguishable by status. So what we are saying active trips dot splice. Now we don't need now to remove it from active trips. So that's another thing, because already it's there and we have changed the status and we have added other attributes. Then the only thing we need to do is to update the active trips table and update the completed trips table. But again, remember we have our local storage that we will need to update. So I'll say update trip in local storage, and I'll pass now my trip here. So that should do it. But now we have to ask ourselves, as much as we have updated, how is the completed trips table behaving? This update completed trips method. So let's go back there and see. We had a couple of console methods here. So we'll just delete them. Those were for testing, just to ensure we are getting the data we expect. As you can see, one was just outputting a string, and the other one was just outputting what was in the completed trips array that we have done away with. So let's see where our data is coming from. So we are saying trips.map, then do that and do that. But I feel we need to filter. So that is .map. So we need to do trips dot. We need to do a filter, and we are filtering by. So when you filter and you get a trip, and you say you need only the trip. You get an instance of a trip, and you say you need to work with trips whose trip status is completed. Here, remember the trip status has changed. So you're saying before you map, I'm going to show you the trips that you want to work with. And therefore, we have introduced a filter. So you say for all the trips, go through them and try to find trip whose trip status is completed. So this should work for us. And I think that's okay. So let's test it and see. Let's test it and see. End trip. So you can see I have ended it, but now it's still counting. It means we have a problem somewhere. Let me just reload and see. You see? So I've ended it, but it's still counting. It means we have an issue under active trips. So let's see whether in active trips we have a filter. So here we are. So we are saying trips.map. Now, this map has an issue because we have not filtered. So we need to filter and say that the trips we need are filtered. So, no, sorry. So filter, and you say you're getting an instance, but you get a trip. You will get a trip where the trip status equals, use the three equal says for the equality symbol, equals new. So if I say that, then you see it has changed. But again, how are we calculating? How are we doing our timer? So remember, for each trip, you see, this should also be filtered. The same way we have filtered the trips we are mapping into our table, then we need to filter this. So what do? We introduce a filter, and we say here we have trips dot for each. So we need to filter the trips that we are working with. So I'll do, as much as we are iterating, let me just select doing it systematically. So for the trips, I'll say add a dot filter. It's a higher order array method. So I'll say for each trip that I have, I need to only work with trips where the trip status equals to new. And then after that, for the other trips that are remaining, now we can loop over. We can say for each trip, then start a timer. So with that, I think we are pretty much home and dry. I will add another element here. I'll say Francesca Totti, and the customer ID is that, the gender is male, this is on the dot, start. So let's see what happens with Francesca Totti. So I don't know why I can't inspect. Let me inspect and see under applications. Under applications, so we have three. So you can see Francesca Totti. You can see the gender is male. And the rest, you can inspect everything here. You can see the trip status for the first one is completed, and the second one is new. The third one is should also be new, right? And the start time is recorded there. So we have essentially done a fully fledged front end and back end with persistence. This is something someone could take Next.js and do, or Laravel, or Livewire, or React. But you can see once you go back to the basics, you are able to do same things with the native technologies, HTML5, JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, and CSS, and you can do a decent job if you want to. But what the frameworks do, they try to become opinionated in the way you structure your code, such that you'll have an area that has models, an area that has controllers, a certain way of doing routing and authentication, which is okay. But from time to time, we need to emphasize that even as you're jumping into those frameworks, it is very good to have a grasp of the fundamentals. Because even if you went to Angular and you're doing this kind of stuff, it will be interesting. But you see, the kind of things we are doing, mapping, filtering, those do not change. They will remain the same. And therefore, mine was to emphasize that we're able to do a lot of things, almost everything, using JavaScript and HTML, things that have been highly abstracted by the frameworks that we are using. So with that, I look forward to the next session when we will be doing the backend and precisely synchronizing to a backend. And for that, we will use Express and Node.js and Express, and also have a function that synchronizes at a certain interval. So thank you for watching. I hope you're learning, and if you're able and are inspired and you have learned something from this, please support us in whichever way you can so that we are able to continually bring you quality, applicable, real world use cases to learn from. Thank you.